In this video, we're going to cover Arcane Mages. Let's start by covering stats and reforging. Now, as you can see from the stats equation, intellect is by far the most important primary stat, followed by hit rating. There's a current debate raging about which is more important, crit, mastery, or haste. There really isn't any conclusive evidence to indicate that any one of them is stronger than any of the others. One way to find out an optimum configuration of your stats is to make use of a third-party add-on like Simulation Craft. Simulation Craft is a wonderful add-on. It'll look at your gear and it'll tell you based on your current gear configuration what the optimum stats equation is for you. I recommend checking it out. Let's move on to reforging. You'll have two main objectives. The first will be to reach the hit rating cap of either 6% for heroics or 17% for raids. Next, you'll want to use an add-on like Simulation Craft to determine what your strongest and weakest secondary stats are. Once you determine your strongest and weakest secondary stats, then you'll want to reforge your weakest stat into your strongest stat. Let's take a look at some useful gems that you can use to socket your gear as an Arcane Mage. You can see some lists of useful and relevant gems on the screen right now. As a rule of thumb, if the socket bonus is not intellect, then it's more useful to socket with pure intellect gems. If it is intellect, then it's worth gemming to match the socket bonus. Let's take a look at the recommended glyphs for Arcane Mages. You can see the three recommended prime glyphs on the screen. Those include the glyph of Mage Armor, the glyph of Arcane Missiles, and the glyph of Arcane Blast. That's what I chose on my mage, as you can see. All of the major glyphs for Arcane Mages are preferential. They include the glyph of Arcane Power, the glyph of Evocation, the glyph of Mana Shield, the glyph of Polymorph, and the glyph of Frost Nova. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is the glyph of Frost Nova there? This was just a personal decision I made because it pays off to have this particular glyph in situations where you have to kite, which is pretty rare in Cataclysm, but every once in a while it's just nice to have. Again, this is purely preferential. I want to talk about the other two that I went with. The glyph of Mana Shield is very important because of an arcane talent that we'll be talking about here in a couple of minutes. And the glyph of Evocation is really nice to have because as an arcane mage, you don't have quite the survivability or defenses that you would have as a frost mage. So it's nice to be able to regenerate health as you cast Evocation. And that wraps it up for our glyph discussion. Let's move on to our Arcane talent discussion. Like the other talent discussions in the other videos, we're not going to look at every single individual talent. Instead, we're just going to look at the important ones. Let's start by looking at the clear casting talents, including Arcane Concentration and Arcane Potency. Clear casting is a buff that makes your next spell mana free. The way Arcane Concentration works is it periodically gives you the clear casting buff. Arcane Potency it gives you a buff that increases the critical strike chance of your next two spells by 15% after you gain clear casting through Arcane Concentration. Let's take a look at a couple of useful mana regen talents. They include Arcane Concentration, which we just described. Obviously, if you have that buff, it'll increase your mana efficiency. And the other one is actually in the fire tree. It's called Master of Elements. Anytime you crit, it'll refund 30% of the base mana cost for that cast. Very nice talents to have. Let's take a look at a couple of very useful buffing talents in the Arcane tree, starting with Focus Magic. The way Focus Magic works is you cast Focus Magic on a friendly party member, and it increases their critical strike chance by 3%. the way it works is anytime they crit, it will then apply a buff to you that increases your critical strike chance by 3% for 10 seconds. It's very nice to have. The other buffing talent that's nice in the Arcane tree is Arcane Tactics. This is a raid buff that increases the base damage dealt by a raid or a party by 3%. Let's move on to a couple of the Arcane tree DPS cooldowns, starting with Arcane Power. Arcane Power is a really nice spell because it has a very short 1.5 minute cooldown, and it also increases your damage dealt by 20%. This is your main DPS cooldown as an Arcane Mage. Another talent that is arguably a DPS talent is Presence of Mind. When you activate it, your next spell with a casting time less than 10 seconds will be instant. If you just think it through, an instant cast is going to increase your damage a little bit. Presence of Mind, like when I use it, I usually use it right before an Arcane Blast. In fact, Presence of Mind, in the case of my mage, is actually activated from inside of a macro, so I just keep it on cooldown. But you can use it for other things too, like an instant sheep. Let's take a look at the slow talents in the Arcane tree. Starting with slow. Slow is a really awesome ability, especially for kiting situations. What you do is you cast it on a target. It reduces their movement speed by 60%, reduces the time between ranged attacks by 60%, and increase casting time by 30%. So it does a lot of really nice things. The only drawback is that you can only use slow on one target at a time. Another related slow talent is called Torment the Weak. The way it works is your arcane damage is increased by 6% if that particular target is already afflicted with a slow debuff. So this gives you yet another reason to make use of slow. The other slow talent is Nether Vortex. This gives your arcane blast spells the property of applying a slow debuff whenever you cast them on a target. The way this works is a little bit weird. Unlike, for example, Frostbolt, when you cast Frostbolt and it hits the target and the debuff is instantly applied, Nether Vortex works a little bit different because you cast Arcane Blast and there's like a split second between the time it actually hits the target and the time that it actually applies the debuff. There's a tiny little bit of a gap of time there. Let's take a look at some of the other miscellaneous arcane talents, starting with Incanter's Absorption. In my opinion, this is a really awesome spell. The way it works is whenever you have your mana shield up and you take damage, it'll give you this Incanter's Absorption buff that increases your spell damage for 10 seconds. It's really nice to also, if you spend a talent point on Incanter's Absorption, to also make use of the Glyph of Mana Shield because it reduces the cooldown of your Mana Shield by 2 seconds. I think it's a really powerful talent. Improved Arcane Explosion is a really nice talent. In the past, Arcane Explosion used to be a really weak spell and pretty expensive. With the addition of this talent, it reduces the global cooldown of Arcane Explosion by half of a second, so you can really spam it a lot. It also reduces the threat generation and also the mana cost, so it's really nice to have if you plan on doing a lot of AoE pulls, like in Heroics. The last talent that we want to talk about in the Arcane tree is Improved Mana Gem. This is sort of a DPS cooldown talent. The way it works is anytime you use a Mana Gem, it gives you a buff that increases your spell power for 15 seconds. We'll talk about how Improved Mana Gem fits into your rotations later in the tutorial. And that wraps up our talent discussion for Arcane Mages. Let's move on to some single target and AoE strategies.